Welcome to Transforming Urban, the webcast and podcast that really unpacks the intersection of Chicago politics, Chicago real estate, and Chicago Black history. Today, we have what I consider a leisure and hospitality Chicago pioneer, Miss Alisa Starks. She's the founder and CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Inner City Entertainment. Alisa, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, I am so happy that we got connected by Daryl Newell some time ago. And you are a fellow Wildcat, a graduate of Northwestern University, and from a master's degree and an undergraduate degree from Northwestern. So you just stayed in Evanston, right? Yeah.
For 5 years, I went straight through.
Straight through. So talk to me, though, about before Northwestern. So where'd you go? Were you born in Chicago?
I was born and raised in Chicago on the South Side in the South Shore neighborhood. I went to Catholic grammar school and high school, St. Philip Neri on 72nd Street. And at the time, Aquinas, an all-girls high school, was also right next door. So like Northwestern, I didn't go far to get those two degrees. So my parents, my mother is a teacher, or was a teacher, I should say. She's long since retired. And my dad, who's deceased, was a social worker.
Oh, wow. And so most people take that sort of Catholic school track and go to Loyola or DePaul. What made you choose Northwestern?
I was valedictorian of my high school class.
Wow.
In my yearbook, many people thought I'd be an accountant because they were impressed with how great I was with numbers. But I had also had a few poems written by a little book that Eugene Perkins had published. And I really felt I was more of a creative type, even though I loved the numbers. And I wanted to write, or at least be, what my vision was really about using my words to change the world. You know, we all think when we're young, we want to help people. And what I really wanted to do, there was no Oprah Winfrey. And the closest thing to what I wanted to be at the time was Barbara Walters. And so I wanted to be in broadcast journalism, but I also wanted to go to the best schools. So Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism was considered the best at the time, and their focus was primarily editorial and print. And I figured I'd make the transition somehow, some way.
Got it. So that's a great sort of understanding of, really taking the time to understand where you wanted to go to school, and, sort of the focus of that, the curriculum of that particular school was a drive towards Northwestern. Did you think was that your first choice, or did you have any other thoughts about leaving Chicago, or how?
I never thought about leaving Chicago early on. My mother always used to say, well, I did end up leaving right after I got married. My husband, he was an investment banker. So he had gotten I guess you would call it a promotion, but it was really more of a lateral move to the LA office for the Bank of Montreal. And I wasn't going to let my husband at the time go off to LA by himself. So I went with him. So my mother used to say, when I wanted you to go away, you didn't go away. And she was really upset because she felt like I was going for good. But I always envisioned myself staying in the Chicago area, living in the Chicago area, and in some way impacting the communities where I lived. So that was always a part of the mission. But it started out in a very different capacity than it ended up.
Well, that is a wonderful story as we transition a little bit into your entry into commercial real estate. And most people, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Lauren Lowry. I'm the host of this podcast, and I've been working in urban spaces for the last 30 years, but I'm also a historian and an archivist. And the goal for this podcast is to really understand how regular human beings can transform their communities. And you don't have to be a superstar. You can have a completely different dream and goal, and you can have an impact on our communities. And again, our urban communities and corridors are really important. And the first thing that people see are the commercial corridors. You are a leisure and entertainment sort of specialist. Again, I would suggest in that sector of retail. And talk to me about sort of, the formation of your company and why in what 1997, why in the 1990s, why would you consider sort of pivoting to that type of work?
Well, going back to a little bit about Northwestern, I went through 4 years in the Medill School of Journalism in the editorial print arena. And while I was still at Northwestern, in a journalism program, you have a lot of electives. And during my electives, a lot of it I still was taking. People couldn't understand I was taking statistic classes. It's like, don't you like to write? How are you taking statistics? But I also ended up taking the only advertising course that was not part of Medill at the time, and fell in love with it. It was during my junior year, and I realized that through advertising, I could not, through like an account management position, equivalent to a brand management position, I could not only be creative, but I could also be analytical. And that made me just change directions totally. It was like, I'm going into advertising. And Medill did have, as part of its master's program, an advertising sequence. So I took that, eventually got hired at Burrell. That was a story in itself, because they were not used to hiring what they considered entry-level people with no experience in actually working at another advertising firm. But I eventually got in and worked my way up the top. But through that experience, with working with a variety of clients, kept thinking I was going to develop a restaurant. I knew I was going to be in the corporate world for some time, but I knew my ultimate goal, outside of broadcast journalism, whatever journalism was, advertising, was coming back to the neighborhood where I grew up and developing a restaurant. And what Burrell taught me, because eventually, and I won't go into the long story of all my long career at Burrell, but I eventually ended up the vice president account director and working on the McDonald's account. And that account really inspired the move to, oh, I know how to do it now. Learning, meeting Black McDonald's owner operators, learning about, the process of acquiring a franchise, sometimes owning real estate, not owning real estate, really helped shape what I wanted to do. I still knew at that time that I wanted to, well, at that time I didn't, but, I always wanted to do a restaurant. And it wasn't, when I lived in LA for 3 years, we happened to meet a gentleman who was a manager. He managed athletes, he managed entertainers, and he happened to be the business manager for a company that at that time owned the Baldwin Theaters. And the Baldwin Theaters was the first African-American owned movie theater that could play first run movie theaters. The reason being is they fought along with an advertising agency in LA, fought alongside the Justice Department, the studios, to gain access to first run films. Until then, and this was much earlier than 1997, but until then, probably in the 70s, most of the Black-owned movie theaters were all second run. They didn't get the first release of the film. They came in during the discounted dollar phase, I'll call it. And they fought. So while I was in LA, we met these people, never thinking I was developing a movie theater. I still thought we were going to be developing a restaurant in Chicago. And when we came back to Chicago, I owned a condo in South Shore that we had left. And on 71st Street, there was a for sale sign going up. I literally saw the man on the ladder putting the for sale sign on an old single screen movie theater, and the light bulb went off. I realized then, after having been at Burrell for probably 5 years, then that this was a big opportunity. It's like, we met these people in LA, and if I hadn't met them, I would have probably never even thought of movie theaters. But it was like, don't we know these people who did this? And the Baldwin was once a old single screen theater that had been converted into 3 screens, and it was doing very well. And I was impressed with the men who were running the facility, and their commitment to the Black community. And what many people may not know about the Baldwin Theater, it was a white stucco building that survived the LA riots. It was untouched. They also had their own walk of fame of Black movie stars on there. It was just, it was like, wow, I could do this. And just then, seeing this guy standing on top of this old single screen theater, on the ladder, putting up a sale sign, I could just see it. Also, my experience at Burrell, because Burrell Communications Group, now it's called, focused primarily on African-American marketing. And so the learning I had, working on Procter & Gamble, working on Legs Pantyhose, working on California State Lottery, I had access to a lot of research information, psychographic, consumer behavior data, just a lot of things to help shape in my goal of what I always knew I was going to do, is develop a business in a Black community. And right. McDonald's was the most relevant to me, because you had an owner operator, you had owners who were purchasing land, who you were developing programs for outside of the national advertising campaigns to engage with the Black community. We were developing programs, taking into account all the experiences. And one of the projects that I was asked to work on by McDonald's had to do with researching, because a lot of these Black McDonald's owner operators came around in the 70s, and inquiring, and of course you'll hear a lot from Black owner operators that a lot of times they were putting those Black owner operators in Black communities. So the challenges those Black communities faced when it came upon in the 90s, those were the times when we were addressing that, the LA riots. There was an article too that had appeared in, I can't remember if it was the Times magazine, or what magazine it was, but during the LA riots, it referenced the fact that the Baldwin Theater was a Black business that was not touched during the LA riot, or I shouldn't say a Black business, but in the Black community, Baldwin was a business that was not touched during the LA riots. And they also referenced a McDonald's owner operator. And part of the story was that it was the relationship that the Baldwin had. It was the relationships that the owner operators had in the Black community, that made people say, no, you don't touch that. And today, what I understand, having gone through the recent looting that's happened in many communities, Black communities across the country, is that these efforts aren't as haphazard as the news media would let you think, that just people are going crazy and that a lot of this isn't intentional. They miss the fact that people are upset because when they walk down the streets, they see a lot of vacant lots, they see boarded up buildings, and they see people owning businesses in their community who don't come back and support those communities. So a lot of the efforts were very intentional. And so that only spurred me more. If you knew my background, my dad was, in addition to being a socialist, he was a Pan-Africanist in the very way. So my mom, we grew up understanding, my sister and I, that whatever we did, they didn't force it on it, but it was the way they lived, the things they exposed us to that allowed us to say, we're coming back to the community and we're going to be a part of the solution. So Northwestern was just let's get the knowledge, right. A part of getting the knowledge to bring back into our communities and be a part of the solution. So real estate. So of course, McDonald's, the experience learning about McDonald's allowed me to think about the strategy of how we were going to develop movie theaters in the community. The guy that we met that was the business manager for the Baldwin Theater, he had a nasty taste about franchises in his head. And he had once, and the reason we learned later that he had owned a group of gasoline stations, and they were one of a few minorities who did own gasoline stations with this chain. And they all ended up, you know, I guess you would say suing the company. And because they didn't own the property, they didn't own. And so, you know, you're going to get eaten hard up by on the property side, you're going to get eaten up by the supply side, just every which way. And I watched some of that, and you hear some of that in the press today about from McDonald's owner operators. That's hard because the company is always, you know, trying to get more money out of its franchisees. And that's just how the system is built. So I was very clear through my learnings of meeting people and my experience on McDonald's that part of the strategy of redeveloping our communities was also ownership, land ownership. So it was an important part of what we hear. And even today, as I work closely with people along the 71st Street corridor in South Shore, that's a resonating theme that we want people who live in the community to own the properties that are in here. And that's a goal of the community, goal of the aldermen, goal of, you know, a lot of the nonprofits, local nonprofits that are here, is we can no longer have in our communities land, buildings that are operated with people who don't live here. And because it doesn't benefit us. When they decide they want to just sit on some property, they can just sit on some property, it'll be vacant, and that's okay. When they decide that they don't want to lease it to us, to our store, you know, the stores we want to develop, that's a problem. So a top priority for the community and always for me has been land ownership. And in some models, traditionally, that wasn't the case. As an example, in movie theaters, many of the large circuits do not own most of their properties. They are leasing inside, you know, shopping centers or big malls. It is not a part of the traditional structure, even though some circuits do have a disproportionate portion of properties that they own. Even with restaurants, most restaurants, that is not really a part of the strategy because you don't know if you're going to survive. You know, the thought behind this is you're lucky if you survive beyond 5 years. But again, I always try, you know, I didn't care what their models were because again, I'm thinking about the communities that I'm trying to serve. So I focused in on land ownership.
Wow, you have touched on so many relevant points as it pertains to commercial real estate and development even today. So when you talk about McDonald's, learning and understanding how these franchisees are purchasing land, what's important to them, the dynamic structure financially to do that, build, operate, the time it takes to open, that kind of thing. I remember, I think a guy named Maurice King, when I started working in real estate, one of my first International Council of Shopping Center meetings, everyone was enamored with McDonald's because they were buying land. You wanted them in your center in some way. You wanted to drive through in there. So if we could get to Maurice King, the Black guy who was driving the real estate at McDonald's, I wonder where he is. I haven't remembered his name in 20 years, but that was a very big deal. And then you touched on something that's really critical. I'm going to have you expand on this a little bit more. When you talk about what something that is so critically important is Black ownership of land, and certainly in the commercial corridors that we can then use to empower our community members and empower small businesses and large businesses and Black owned whatever ideas. You can ideate on sort of Black things that we can realize at a certain point. It's so important that we're owning those parcels and making sure that the public knows that this is Black owned, because sometimes now people are a little cagey. There are a lot of Black owned little strip centers in Chicago, but some people don't even realize that they are Black owned. Maybe oftentimes I always wonder whether or not we developed some of those, because 87th and Cottage Grove, on the short term, the larger center is not Black owned, but maybe one building is now. And then you think about 87th and Dan Ryan. Maybe they were developed back in the day, or it was ideated to be developed by Black people, but it is certainly not owned by people of African descent today. And so there's a lot of people making a lot of money on land in Black neighborhoods. And then the riots, again, if people know that it is Black owned, maybe we won't touch it. The McDonald's wasn't touched. The movie theater wasn't touched when the Rodney King riots happened. How could that have played differently in our communities if we recognize that that strip center where the Walgreens is and where the whatever is, if they thought that there were people of African descent who owned those things and took care of them and cared about whether or not people got their medicines from there and their groceries from there, would we have reacted differently during
I think
those
so.
times? Yeah,
I think I really do think that it's a little bit more consciousness than people realize, even from people who aren't as educated or people who are out here wealthy who know that. They know they know more than people think they know, and they know that they're a lot of it is how they're treated by people who aren't like them, who own those properties. I learned a lot. Like I said, going back to the McDonald's with the riots in LA during the Rodney King incident, Burrell working on those campaigns for those local market advertising and understanding that this was an operator who was using some of the things I was developing, how to be engaged in your community. So people know who you are. They know who the local McDonald's owner is of those stores. If they're doing the right thing, people know. Sometimes there may be owners who don't want people to know who they are. But if you're letting people know who you are and you're investing back into the community, they know. As an example, talking about the theaters that we built in 1997, there was never any damage, anything done, no rocks thrown at the theater, no anything done throughout that whole entire time, almost 20 years of operating multiplex movie theaters, because people knew they knew who we were. Right. Personally, they could walk into the theater and see us. They could see the types of programming that we were bringing in addition to first run movies. They could see and feel the community days that we did for the communities. There was no mistaking that it was there. The only mistake is that they thought some people thought it was owned by Magic Johnson versus Donzel and Alisa Starks, but it was intentional. And I think that for me, I always thank God for steering me, because I think about how fortunate I was to be able to, he put me in the path to be able to get all these experiences, because I had a set thing that I thought I was going to do right off the bat, right? And I was going to be in broadcast journalism, but, I would say the Lord has figured out that you would be most impactful back inside the community, not on the camera, not on the screen, but you need to be in the community. And just the experiences I had that put me into place. Who knew I was going to LA for 3 years? Who knew I'd be traveling with the owners of the Baldwin Theater? Who knew I would be eventually on the Burrell account and working on McDonald's? I tried to stay away from the McDonald's account because it was like a revolving door until I got on it. So when I think about every experience, I said, wow, because this was not the game plan, even though the mission was always the same, but coming back to the communities, to doing good in the community. And I just feel, that I'm able in this role to help so many people who are thinking about getting into business, thinking about real estate development. And so those are the things that I do challenge people who come to me and say, well, I just need to talk to you about my business. I need to talk to you about my business idea. And I usually give most people an hour of my time. And I leave them with things to think about, as it relates to how they're developing their business, which a lot has to do with real estate. Why did you choose that location? Are you locked into that location? I want you to think about it a little bit more and do some more research on that location. Why that business? Why do you think you can just sell 1 million widgets? What, based on what? And I feel blessed to have been grounded in the training of advertising and marketing, because it makes you support anything you do. We have to do that to our clients, support it with research, everything. So I feel blessed about the path that I took.
Well, it sounds magnificent. You had a great grounding with your parents and understanding, Black communities and recognizing that you want to empower those communities. And you can do that in many different ways. And you've done that both on the advertising side, and now you've done that in a very physical way with your movie theaters. And you always thought you wanted to have a restaurant, and all of these things are grounded in commercial real estate. And this goal is really to use the lessons and experiences that you have to assist us in the future with how we move forward, sort of in our real estate practices. So
yeah, and the one thing I wanted to add about that is, no matter what the field that we go to, I think people a lot of times when they want to start a business, they keep wanting to hoard things like somebody's going to steal it. Most ideas already exist, and you're not replicating. You're either like movie theaters have existed for a long time, but it's how what I'm choosing to do in the movie theater industry that's uniquely different, and how I approach the industry and make it more relevant to my consumer, who is a targeted, predominantly African-American market. And too many people don't want to talk about the nuts and bolts of what they're trying to do. And I encourage people to talk to as many people as they can, because you're going to need all of those resources to get some of these things done. It takes a lot of money, to do what I'm doing now. This project isn't as big as the original one. That was a $40 million project with the 3 ICE theaters. This is probably more of a $20 million project. But even though it should be easier today, it's just as hard for minorities to be able to come out and do anything, open a head shop,
Exactly. Before I get to what you're doing on 71st and Stony Island in Chicago, Illinois, in Chicago South Shore community, your grounded community, I want to talk to you a little bit about your first movie theater. I know you're working maybe on 3 at the same time in sort of inner city sort of, communities in Chicago. But who was your team? Were there Black people on your team? How did you decide this is the location? Who introduced you to those locations in North Lawndale and Chatham, et cetera? Who were the Black professionals on your team? Could you have gotten all those deals done with all Black people? Who were the Black professionals helping you?
One key, I would say, in terms of the land, we did our homework. We knew that the Chatham community was a home run for multiplex movie theaters. On the outside, sometimes people think that, because we closed the theaters or sold the theaters, that they weren't profitable. That is far from the truth. But we chose Chatham because it had all the bells and whistles. And a lot of times people don't look inside the Black community, but another important thing to know about inside, we are a very concentrated population, oftentimes in most markets across the country. So while, you'll have general market or national brands that disregard our communities based on income and things like that, they miss the fact that it's not about our income. Well, one, because we are consumers, very avid consumers. But the second part is because we're so highly concentrated. So what you don't get in someone who totally can't afford to go to the movie, you make up in the numbers. There's the sheer numbers of people. And they miss it. They miss it every time. And it's why Home Depot is so successful at 87th and the Dan Ryan. They took a chance based on the numbers. And that's one of their largest grossing stores. People sometimes get irritated because they feel like the store is disorganized in comparison to other Home Depots. But it's because so many people are going through these stores.
Right.
And they've got to change inventory so much faster than so many. And so it is very clear, if you do your homework, the amount of people that you can touch and reach for any business is so much greater in our communities if you do things right. So Chatham was chosen as the site. And as we were developing the site, and Home Depot actually went and bought the land, all of the land that we were looking at, because it was all available at the time. And my husband was sitting in a meeting with at the Chatham Business Association. There was Garth. We both forgot the Taylor Wright was there, the owner. There was my mother had remarried to Booker Davis, Imperial Carpet. That's how he got my husband down. And the husband at the time was even in the meeting in the room when Home Depot presented its plan to develop its store at 87th and the Dan Ryan.
Joseph Caldwell. Joe Caldwell, Mr.
Caldwell, yes. And I know his son very well because his son had married a woman who's since passed at Aquinas. So yeah. So
oh, interesting. Vernon,
so
it was Vernon.
Yes. And so
Yeah,
it was so it was so my husband at the time, because we had initially had planned to, we were partners in a deal to buy the Baldwin that failed. Then we went off to Atlanta and they were all excited. The project was supposed to be up and running before the Olympics in Atlanta. And just as that was, the city was fighting over who would be the developer of the site, Home Depot announces that it's, that it had actually purchased the property. And so my husband, Don, thought, wow, we just missed our opportunity. Somebody's bought the land. But when he explained to me what happened in the meeting, I said, no, this is the best thing that could have happened to us. You had Garth and those guys, the old guard, who, you have to give them credit because they said, Home Depot, we want your first store in an African-American community to be here. And, but we've got some issues. You've bought all 21 acres or whatever it was of the property, the vacant land, but you only plan to use half of it. And so we have two questions. What do you plan to do with the other half? And what is your minority plan? We need, because one of the existing stores, hardware stores, was Black owned. And they knew that a Home Depot coming to the area would just kill it. So what's the plan? So it was fantastic because that meant our next meeting was with Home Depot. And to go to Home Depot and say, we can solve your problem. We're Black. We're developing multiplex community theaters. We need all the extra land. And so you can get started tomorrow. So let's agree on a price. And so we had a term sheet and the rest was history. And then once the movie industry found out that there was this husband and wife couple that wanted to develop movie theaters in Chicago, I guess then they began to take a deep dive into the site and realized, oh my God, it's a great site. It has all the bells and whistles. And they went to Home Depot trying to outbid us. But the issue is Home Depot was locked into a contract. They said, I would love to take your extra money, but they haven't defaulted on a contract yet. Right. And Cineplex Odeon, instead of going against us, called us to a meeting to Toronto. We said, here it is. It's about to happen. And ultimately, after our meeting, they realized what we wanted to do, how far we had come in the plans and the development of the theater and said, we want to partner. We learned from them that the city of Chicago, at that time, Mayor Daley, had been seeking, Cineplex Odeon had the leading share of screens in the Chicagoland area. So the city understandably had targeted them because they were looking for an employer who could provide entry-level jobs in Chicago Lawn and Lawndale. And that's how those two sites came. And Cineplex Odeon said, we can't do it without Chatham. You know, you picked the home run site. That makes it all makes sense. And so that's how it happened from a land standpoint. So our relationship was such that ICE owned all of the land. We built the buildings and all of that, but we had initially Cineplex Odeon operate the movie theaters. So that's where we are.
Got it. And so your team back then, again, so that's a
yes,
big.
So the team was really not this high-powered team in the sense that you had Don, you know, more, and you had myself. There were other people that were involved through the way, but nope, they weren't experienced in movie theaters, in operating movie theaters. It was, they shared the vision and wanted to help. I would say the biggest person that people would recognize that helped us was Tom Burrell at Burrell Communications Group. I knew at a certain point when we would start to go to talk to banks, that somebody would pick up the phone and say, who this Alisa Starks?
Right.
And so I went to Tom, and a lot of people don't know this about Tom, but he has launched a number of helped launch, not personally launched, but helped launch other businesses that were started by people who worked at Burrell. Some were advertising related, like production, and but others were totally different. And for us, he allowed us to meet with his board and to present his our business plan to the board. And he also gave us resources in connecting us with people in real estate and other things. So I give all credit to Tom Burrell for any relationships. Some of those were clearly on the board were black and white, but on the in terms of the real estate, those were not African Americans. I mean, a lot of it was just literally done by us having experience in the advertising, that me being able to know how to put together a plan, how to research this. I had access to information that made it possible to understand the opportunity, the scope of the opportunity that was in front of us.
Got it.
And everybody's not going to have that, but you can find the research. If I hadn't worked at Burrell, you know, I haven't worked there in how many years now? 30 years. So, but the research is out here. There's information you can buy or not buy to help people formulate a plan. And we didn't have a feasibility study. We were just lucky. I mean, again, I say God, only God could have made that happen. The story of how this all came about, because they just picked up the phone. Cineplex Odeon picked up. And at the time we had been meeting with, because we were planning on Atlanta, we had been meeting with banks, and the only objection people had, they saw our business plan. The strategy we used was take the business plan, put it in the right people's hands and say, just take a look at it. Let it, call us before we even try to do a loan. Just tell us what you think about it. And at the time, before the Home Depot meeting, the things that banks said, we believe you. One, because Magic had got his first theater up. Magic Johnson had got his first theater up in Crenshaw. So the numbers, they knew it was successful. And second, their only objection was that we had never done it before, that we had any question that they had, we were able to bring film buyers in to explain to them, I didn't need a big chain to partner with us, because they're independent movie theater buyers, you would call them film buyers. But so every issue, well, what about security? We had the articles, that were written that talked about, that would get them comfortable. And my McDonald's experience, I learned from McDonald's experience, what do you have to do in the Black community? You need lots of lighting and all these other things. So they understood it. The only objection that they had was that we had never done it before. So when we got the call from Cineplex, we were like, man, this ain't nothing. All we got to do is sell ourselves. And we walked out of that meeting. I don't think they thought we would pull it off, because we took the responsibility of getting the financing. We took the responsibility of the next steps. I think they thought we were going to renege. The issue was, we knew what the bank said. The only thing is, you haven't done it before. We were coming now with Cineplex Odeon that had been in business for 35 years. So they didn't know, they had no clue. They were sweating bullets when they found out we were setting up meetings so fast, and that the banks were like, well, we know the Starks, we know their capabilities. Tell us about you, Cineplex Odeon. Right. So that's basically the story in very briefly.
Well, that's a great story. I mean, if I sort of relay what I heard, even with not a lot of experience, but understanding that you had data, understand that you had examples from other sectors of real estate, how to build, how to operate, how to make better any entity that would be in urban corridors to impact Black people. So you knew how to do that, and you can sell yourself. Because now you're in public relations, you're in advertising, you know how to sell yourself. Right. You know how to put together a coalition of people, even outside of real estate or the industry, like Mr. Burrell, to support what you're doing and to create that team that says you can go out and be successful. So those are great. That's great inspiration for young developers, because not everyone's going to have the backup that everybody. Our goal is to make sure that every young developer now has the experiences, knows the attorneys that know what they're doing, knows the contractors that know what they're doing. Again, making sure you've got fantastic representation across the board, from real estate to legal, to environmental, to construction, all those things. We're hoping that we can synergize so people at least have some background information. But you were successful even without all of that. You got it done. And, you made a
sometimes you need strategic partners. What we did is we identified a strategic partner, and really they came to us not knowing that we had all this other stuff with us, and the support of the city, the support of the, a lot of other things that just bells and whistles. We just weren't pie in the sky dreaming without anything behind us. So it made for a great partnership. It was different than the Magic Sony partnership. We knew we wanted to come in. We wanted to own the property and eventually take over the operations, and which we ultimately did. So now we've got the experience. So it wasn't necessarily all as you were looking for before. Who were the Black people? The Black people were people who were out there doing their own things, that had the ability to give us advice, give us resources that we didn't have. And they weren't necessarily going to be tied to the business, but then having a strategic partner. And a lot of times we often look away from that. In fact, we didn't want a partner. In fact, we worked hard not to have a partner. And our struggle was that banks were looking at this, and we wanted Black banks, to be a part of this. And it was like, what is going on here? But ultimately having the strategic partner who had done it before, who was willing to share in the benefits of these sites and do more, was important. So sometimes you have to partner with people, and that's what,
a lot of the Black developers now and all of their projects, mixed use, retail, residential, they're all sort of partnering with folks. And sometimes they're partnerships that are majority people of color. And sometimes, you're dealing with European partners, and, however you can get the deal done, get the experience, and then you can take that and move it to the next level.
Exactly.
So everywhere in the world, I'm going to sort of pivot a little bit to sort of getting things done and then having some setbacks. So winning normally comes with a price, and certainly winning while Black is oftentimes even treacherous. Sometimes, to use a word like, could be daunting. What did you find? Because I know you got some press for opening these centers. People are happy about it. The community's kind of happy about it at one point. And then sometimes things take a turn within a small amount of time.
Yes.
What should a young developer be prepared for while they're winning and while they're getting press and while they're sort of getting things done? What are sometimes the implications of winning and sort of what people think you're being successful in what you're doing?
I don't know if it's implications of winning, but you're going to have setbacks no matter what in your business. Sometimes you can grow too fast. Sometimes you can't, you're not growing fast enough. There's no market. There are times that there are failures. Fortunately for us, those failures had nothing to do with the business concept, the idea itself. Our setbacks had to do with the fact that we had partnered with a company that was on the brink of either had to merge. Their credit wasn't the greatest. So that made their appetite for wanting to do this deal better, but for all the wrong reasons. And so when Cineplex, a year after we developed the theaters, Cineplex Odeon had merged with Sony Lowe's, and that sent our relationship into a tizzy. And then years later, Sony Lowe's, because of how we were structured, filed for bankruptcy protection. And one of the interesting clauses, even though all of our theaters were doing fine, they were on our financial documents triggered a technical default, not a financial. We were paying off the loan, just moseying along very fine, but it was a technical default. Well, I'm not a banker, and it was a clause. No one ever thought that we would be in partner with someone that would go ahead. And then theaters hadn't done it before that year, but that year, most of the major companies had filed for protection under bankruptcy and to restructure. And we were caught in that. And we had to do scrambling. So the default interest rate shot up. It was like, oh, Lord. So, and it was a learning lesson. So we were scrambling to find other equity partners. And then again, ended up with a partner who was invested in the vision. And they wanted to do something else. And that equity partner, got upset when we decided, because when we were in trouble, we ended up having to close the Lawndale and the Chicago Lawn location. But there was funds we knew we could get to reopen it. And he got pissed. It was like, these are properties. You getting pissed. And he backhandedly tried to take our property away from us at Chatham. It was just an interesting thing. And it was a learning lesson of, it did put a nasty taste in my mouth about partnerships. It's what people fear about partnerships.
Yes.
But even though still the lessons it was right in our face. I was totally against all of these because you have to listen to what the information is telling you. And if the information says this partner is not vested, you don't do the deal. And when you don't listen, things happen. What is it? Shit happens. And so what we learned is our partnerships weren't the best. The first one we needed to get off the ground. The second one we should not have ever done, ever. And that was the learning lesson. And so things happen, but you can regroup. And, we're not the only ones who have businesses. I don't call them failures. I call them learning lessons, because every time I know what not to have in my contracts with the banks. Nope, we ain't going with that.
Right.
We ain't going with that. If I default, then you have the right to do that, but not if our partner, you're giving too much credence to them and to their role in this relationship. And you should just never partner with somebody who is telling you, well, if this isn't the best use, are you willing to change the use? Well, they're not committed because this is the use. Chatham has remained a movie theater all this time. Right. And it's changed hands, and for different reasons, like Studio Movie Grill did not fail, but it's not about, they just didn't do it right. Instead, they should have gutted the theater and made it into a Studio Movie Grill like their other ones with smaller auditoriums, change where the kitchen. There are a lot of things that caused them to back out of it, and it just got confusing for them. I've watched them, and then you never retain the relationship with the community, even though they're supporting you and the numbers are great. But you kept monkeying them around with changing. Are you a dine-in cinema? Are you concessions? They kept going back and forth. So I'm watching it. I'm like, it's a great idea. We brought millions of dollars back into the community. We created hundreds and hundreds of jobs. This is the right thing to do. It transformed in all three communities what was more than 50% vacant or 100% vacant in West Side became, there were more retail, more commercial development. So I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Which I plan to do. So in other communities.
And I definitely want to pivot to that. But you basically, again, you are a textbook of exactly why I do this podcast. You just talked to me. We started off talking about strategic partnerships, and you need some of those to move forward. But it's about being clear and understanding your partner and what their vision is, and make sure it merges. Make sure. And then the other thing you highlighted, certainly as it pertains to financing, but across the board, understand those terms and conditions on every level. So having the right legal counsel, having the right financier, making sure that you have people on your team who are looking into your best interest on every smallest detail, so that you can avoid, sort of these unfortunate, unpartnerings, what you have to detach.
Well, I would have never, that's why I said the first contractual issue, there was no way to even plan for that. I mean, that was like, you never seen a movie theater at that point that had ever filed for bankruptcy, so I would have never done that, but there was a way out, and it was the bad decision was a partnership that didn't make sense, and looking for other ways and not feeling rushed, because we weren't rushed. The banks were not rushing us. They were not trying to foreclose on us. They were not trying to do any of that. And we were still making money and still moving forward. We just needed a better partner. So I do say, yes, you got to look at your contracts. You got to have good lawyers. You got to have lawyers that specialize in certain areas for whatever you're trying to do. So I have lawyers I go to for zoning with the city. I have lawyers I have to do with partnerships. I have lawyers I have for real estate acquisitions. They need to be, an expert in the areas around that. And I'm not saying all partnerships are bad. Partnerships are good. We made a critical mistake. It was totally, bad to get someone. It was someone who had a high net worth, lots of money, but his interests weren't aligned. And you've got to talk to people long enough to understand that. So
that's true. How many square feet were the centers in Chatham and North Lawndale? How big were they?
Chatham was about 75,000 square feet. Lawndale was the smallest at 50,000 square feet, and Chicago Lawn was 54,000 square feet. So they were big, what I call palaces, because all the auditoriums were fairly large in today's scheme of things. The minimum auditorium in all of the three theaters was 150 seats, and the largest was almost 300 seats, 299. And the learning lesson is Chatham could sustain those large size. The other ones, if I did it over again, would be smaller. Should have been smaller. You would still have 1 300. You might not have 2 300s. You know, you do a mix, and you start with auditoriums that were less than 150 seats. But that's the issue, is the industry at the time was not looking at that. You know, dine-in cinemas were big and a big deal then. And Cineplex Odeon would not have done anything differently. And so, you know, sometimes you need to just trust your gut. And so it was, again, a learning lesson, but it was, it's, you know, it was learning. There were a lot of things that I learned about it, that, oh, this is the way the theater chains have always done it. This is the way they do it. And sometimes you have to do things a little differently because of the marketplace that you're going to. And, you know,
gotta understand the market. Gotta understand the market.
Gotta understand the market.
Yeah, this is so fantastic. So again, so now you're pivoting. Now you have new ideas for 71st Street, the corridor and the community in which you grew up in. What brought you to purchasing those centers? What is the idea, and how is it going? Talk to me about sort of how you came up with that idea and how you acquired these properties.